Hey guys, tonight we slip back through time, not with the dry pages of a textbook, but with the damp air of Mesopotamia clinging to your skin. The scent of river mud, beer, and incense curling in your nose as the torches flicker against brick. Walls older than memory itself, and before you even realize it, you are following music that isn't music at all. A rhythm that sounds like heartbeat mixed with prayer. Like someone whispering your name in a tongue you half understand. And yes, you should probably be worried, because you probably won't survive this. But isn't that the whole point of wandering into history at night? To risk being swallowed by something stranger than fiction. Something that feels like myth, until you find the clay tablets with words carved so carefully they might as well be scars in stone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is. I love knowing who else is wide awake when history is at its strangest. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly across a courtyard still warm from the sun, hearing drums in the distance, and realize that in this ancient land, sex was not hidden behind bedroom doors, but carved into religion itself, stitched into politics, whispered through poetry, and laid bare in temple rituals that make modern scandals look tame. Imagine for a moment, you're standing before a massive ziggurat, its staircase lit by oil lamps, and every step up feels less like walking and more like surrendering to a secret you can't quite name. High above, priestesses of Ishtar, goddess of love and war, wait in chambers lined with cedar and perfumed with myrrh, ready to enact what later generations would call sacred prostitution, though historians still argue whether this was real practice or moral panic etched into text by outsiders who couldn't wrap their heads around a world where desire itself was a pathway to the divine. You shiver, not from cold, but from the thought that here, under the Mesopotamian moon, sex could be prayer, and prayer could be sex, and no one saw the boundary. The first story comes from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, though we twist it back further than Europe's boudoirs into the cradle of civilization. She notes that rulers across history often proved their right to govern, not just on battlefields, but in bedrooms. And in Mesopotamia, this truth was dramatized in what was called the sacred marriage ceremony. Picture it. The king, dressed in robes heavy with embroidery, approaches a high priestess who embodies Ishtar for the night, and before an audience of nobles, poets, and priests, they unite in ritual coupling meant to guarantee fertility for land, flocks, and people. It's hard to tell if the farmers in the fields truly believed wheat would grow straighter because of what happened in palace chambers, but power always loves a spectacle, and nothing binds a crowd like mixing hunger, hope, and lust in one performance. Yet you also hear from Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality that what shocks us is not the act, but the way it was framed. Desire here was neither sin nor secret, but a form of truth-telling, a confession written not in words but in bodies. And while historians still argue whether temple prostitution existed in practice or only in slander, the clay tablets tell enough stories to suggest that Mesopotamians saw intimacy as a cosmic language, something to be spoken in hymns and sweat alike. But don't think it was all solemn and sacred. Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History reminds us that alongside the rituals, there were taverns where beer and sex flowed together, places where a traveler might stumble in for ale and find themselves tangled in arms that felt like both commerce and comfort, a messy human echo of the divine rites happening just a block away. You could almost taste the froth of barley beer, feel the grit of sand between your toes, hear the laughter that sounds too loud for a sacred city, but somehow belongs here. And then there's the quirky tidbit. Some cuneiform tablets record contracts, where women offered their services as part of dowries, suggesting that in this world, sexuality was not just personal but negotiable, legal, and woven into trade as if it were grain or cloth. Imagine signing a marriage deal that listed not just cattle and land but carnal duties in neat, wedge-shaped script. You step back, your head spinning, because in this moment, Mesopotamia feels both impossibly distant and uncomfortably familiar after all. Haven't we moderns also turned desire into transaction, ritual, and spectacle? You glance again at the ziggurat, and the drums keep beating, and you realize that you are being pulled deeper into a world where history is not polite, where it does not avert its eyes, where even in ruins the stones seem to hum with the memory of sweat, perfume, and prayer blending into one. You climb higher up the stone steps, your hand grazing the baked bricks that still hold warmth from a sun long gone. And when you reach the shaded chambers of the temple, you find the priestesses of Ishtar waiting, their bodies draped in linen that smells faintly of cedar smoke and crushed flowers. And you realize that for these women, desire was not shameful or secret but service, a duty wrapped in mystery and power. And every move they made blurred the line between performance and possession. Ancient sources tell you that these women were thought to embody the goddess herself, not as actors in a play, but as vessels through which divinity could touch the mortal world. And when men came forward to lie with them, it was not simply a tryst but a form of worship, a transaction where pleasure and prayer were identical coins. Yet even as you picture the candlelit rooms and the murmurs of devotion, historians still argue whether sacred prostitution was widespread practice or a convenient accusation scribes and outsiders hurled at cities they disliked. For in cultures across the ancient world, nothing condemned an enemy more effectively than claiming their religion was fueled by lust. Michel Foucault once suggested that sexuality has always been the battleground where societies negotiate power and morality. And here in Mesopotamia, you can see the truth of that. For whether the priestess is truly coupled with strangers or not, their presence in myths and hymns proves that sex was considered divine currency, a way to petition gods not through burnt offerings, but through breathless sighs. Eleanor Herman in Sex with Kings offers a parallel centuries later in Europe, where monarchs often surrounded themselves with mistresses who wielded more influence than generals, reminding us that desire has always been a throne's quiet ally. And if that held true in Versailles, how much more potent must it have been in temples where Ishtar herself was said to step into the skin of a woman? Picture a story whispered across clay tablets, a young man, trembling as he approached the high priestess, unsure whether he was about to sin or be sanctified. And in the dim glow of oil lamps he discovers that fear and longing taste the same on the tongue. And then comes the quirky tidbit. When you might not expect, the Mesopotamians sometimes recorded the names of these priestesses on cylinder seals, alongside depictions of lions, stars, and entwined lovers, as if to say that their work was just as official, just as vital, as that of merchants or magistrates. Imagine signing a clay tablet to confirm a shipment of barley, and right beside the record of grain is an image of a goddess in embrace, reminding you that food for the body and food for desire were both stamped with the same authority. Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History notes that across civilizations, the blending of lust and liturgy produced both awe and scandal. And in Mesopotamia, the priestesses of Ishtar stood at the very heart of that paradox, both revered and reviled, both envied and feared. You think of the hymns that survive, songs praising the goddess with words that sound suspiciously like love poems, describing kisses and embraces in metaphors of rivers and gardens. And you wonder whether these verses were sung in crowded courtyards, or whispered into the ears of men who left temples with shaking hands and glazed eyes. Even the Kama Sutra, though born far away in India, speaks of sexual union as a form of spiritual balance, and reading it alongside Mesopotamian myths makes you realize that perhaps humans everywhere once believed that bodies themselves could become temples, that touch itself could be a prayer. Still, the debates rage on. Were these priestesses prostitutes in the way we understand the word, or were they closer to mystics, channeling cosmic forces through ritualized intimacy? Historians still argue whether travelers like Herodotus exaggerated. Tales of Babylonian women lying with strangers as part of devotion, or whether the truth was far subtler, woven into elite ceremonies rather than common life. You smile faintly because you know how rumors work even today. A single scandal can define an entire city, and perhaps Babylon's reputation as a place of sultry priestesses was no more accurate than tabloids, claiming every Hollywood actor belongs to a secret cult. But as you breathe in the incense of the temple chamber, as you listen to the distant drums, it's hard to shake the image of women who ruled through desire, who stood taller than soldiers because their power came not from bronze or blood, but from the magnetic pull of flesh dressed in divinity. And maybe, just maybe, that's the strangest truth of all, that in a land where kings boasted of battles, the real power sometimes lay with a woman who closed her eyes, opened her arms, and convinced everyone watching that the goddess had descended. Among them, that you step out from the shadow of Ishtar's priestesses and into a grand courtyard where the air trembles with the scent of roasting lamb and burning myrrh. And in the center, a dais has been prepared, not for war or for judgment, but for a ceremony so intimate, it makes your heart beat louder than the drums. Because here the king himself will embody Dumuzi, the shepherd god, and he will couple with a high priestess of Inanna to secure the fertility of the fields, the wombs, and even the heavens above. This sacred marriage, carved into hymns and echoed in poems, was not staged in some hidden chamber, but performed in public or semi-public rituals where nobles, priests, and sometimes the common crowd gathered to watch power blur with passion. And as you imagine the golden torches flickering against the king's jeweled robe, you realize that this wasn't merely sex, it was statecraft, a performance meant to fuse authority with divinity in one trembling embrace. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings reminds you that centuries later European monarchs too understood the political value of intimacy, how a royal mistress or a staged wedding night could secure alliances or silence rebellion. And in Mesopotamia, the stakes were no less cosmic, for if the king failed in this ritual union, if the land withered or the rivers shrank, whispers would spread that he had lost the god's favor, and with it, his right to rule. Historians still argue whether the sacred marriage was literal intercourse or symbolic drama acted out through wine, song, and poetry. But the surviving Sumerian hymns leave little doubt about the imagery. Lines describing thighs, embraces, and honeyed mouths suggest a union as sensual as it was spiritual, though whether the audience witnessed every detail or merely believed it happened behind silk curtains remains uncertain. Imagine the pressure of that night, the king, trembling not from passion alone, but from the weight of knowing that an empire's crops and cattle supposedly depended on his performance, and the priestess too carrying the burden of channeling the goddess's favor with every breath she drew. You lean closer, catching a story tucked in clay fragments. A king named Shulgi, praised for his vigor, boasted in hymns about his union with Inanna's priestess, claiming that his embrace made the rivers swell and the fields turn green. And whether that was truth or propaganda, you can't help but smirk at the thought of a ruler securing his reign not with swords, but with bedroom bravado. Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality would have loved this irony, that truth here wasn't written in decrees, but in bodies, that legitimacy itself was staged as an erotic performance, and the line between political theater and personal desire blurred into the smoke of incense. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that during these rituals, participants sang erotic hymns accompanied by harps and drums. So imagine attending a royal rock concert where the main act is not a band but the king himself, and the encore is a harvest promised in sweat and seed. Peter Webb in Asterisk, The Erotic Spirit Through History Asterisk, suggests that such ceremonies reveal how societies once saw sexuality as cosmic glue, binding heaven and earth, king and people. And even if the ritual shocked foreign visitors, locals may have found it reassuring, a way to believe that fertility wasn't left to chance but secured by divine intimacy. Yet debates persist. with some scholars insisting the sacred marriage was stage drama only, while others argue the explicit hymns are too detailed to be purely metaphor. And you can't help but chuckle. After all, historians can argue in libraries for centuries, but in that courtyard, under torchlight and expectant eyes, the question wasn't academic. It was immediate, raw, and unforgettable. You picture the high priestess, her voice steady as she recites verses that blur into moans, her body a canvas painted with divinity, and the king, desperate to prove not just his virility, but his right to govern, clinging to her like a drowning man to driftwood, because in a world where crops could fail and rivers could dry, even rulers needed rituals to reassure their people that life itself would go on. And as the drums grow louder in your ears, you realize that what you're witnessing isn't some distant curiosity. It's the primal truth that power, sex, and survival have always been braided together, and that every civilization, whether Sumerian or modern, finds ways to stage that truth under the lights. You slip away from the echo of royal hymns, and suddenly the air changes, thick with barley beer and roasted onions, the sound of coins clinking against wooden counters, and laughter that is far less reverent than anything sung in temples, because here you've stumbled into the markets of intimacy, places where devotion and desire collide in messy human ways, and every doorway feels like a dare. Imagine taverns along Babylon's streets where travelers from across the desert merchants, mercenaries, priests between rituals crowd together with mugs of frothy ale, and in the corners women and men lean against pillars with eyes that promise both warmth and transaction, their presence making you wonder whether you've walked into a holy place or just a very well-organized brothel. Ancient cuneiform tablets actually mention beer sellers doubling as companions, and while historians still argue whether these were casual flings or regulated extensions of temple culture, the detail is irresistible. The same clay tablets that record debts for sheep and jars of oil also whisper about kisses traded for barley and embraces priced like bundles of reeds. Michel Foucault would smirk here, pointing out that sexuality has always seeped into the spaces society pretends are about something else, that power hides in contracts and ledgers as much as in ceremonies, and suddenly you realize that these markets of intimacy were not just about lust, they were about control, currency, and survival. Eleanor Herman's asterisk, Sex with Kings asterisk, gives us later parallels of European courts where mistresses functioned like political investments, and you can't help but see the echo here, where a single night in a tavern might forge bonds stronger than treaties written in ink. Picture one story, preserved faintly in tradition. A merchant too drunk to count his coins promises himself to a tavern girl, and when he sobers he finds that her family holds him to the bargain, his shame carved into clay like any debt of grain. And then the quirky tidbit that makes you blink. Archaeologists have found drinking songs etched in cuneiform that sound suspiciously bawdy, joking about women who serve beer and more, proof that even 4,000 years ago humanity already had its barroom humor, the kind you'd expect from a rowdy Friday night, rather than an ancient city under divine watch. Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History reminds us that such mingling of sex and trade wasn't a degradation, but a recognition that pleasure itself was part of the economy, as vital as wheat or wool, and in Mesopotamia that truth was carved openly, not hidden behind polite euphemisms. Historians still argue whether every tavern was a disguised brothel, or whether a few scandalous stories painted the whole city as decadent. But as you step deeper into the smoky room, smelling yeast, sweat, and perfume mingled together, it doesn't feel like theory. It feels immediate, urgent, alive. You see farmers laughing too loudly, soldiers rolling dice, women pouring beer with one hand and stroking the shoulder with the other, and you realize that for all the talk of sacred unions and divine rights, the ordinary people found their own rituals, ones fueled by ale and need, not incense and hymns. The scene is messy, loud, intoxicating, and you can't look away, because here the strange truth of Mesopotamia breathes through every cracked cup and half-lit smile. Sex was everywhere. Traded, sanctified, joked about, feared, and celebrated. And maybe that's why you linger in the tavern doorway, heart racing, because you know the next story will only draw you deeper into the labyrinth where desire refuses to stay hidden, where every corner hides a whisper, and where history itself feels drunk on the mingling of flesh and faith. You leave behind the noise of the taverns, your ears still ringing with laughter and dice rolls, and step into a quieter chamber where the air feels heavier, perfumed with resin and dust. And here, instead of people, you find objects staring back at you, shelves lined with clay figurines, amulets strung on faded cords, and tablets covered in wedge-shaped writing that seems to pulse with secrets. Because in Mesopotamia, sex was not only practiced in beds or courtyards, it was carved into symbols, hidden in charms, and encoded in rituals that look harmless until you tilt them under torchlight. Imagine holding a tiny terracotta idol of a woman with exaggerated hips and breasts, her eyes wide as if daring you to understand that she is more than fertility. She is an instruction manual in clay. Historians still argue whether these figures were toys, talismans, or sacred teaching tools, but the fact remains that they were found everywhere, from humble homes to temple storerooms, suggesting that sexuality was woven into daily life, not tucked away in shame. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings shows how centuries later European rulers collected charms and portraits to bolster their virility or seduce partners, proving that humans everywhere have tried to bottle desire into objects to hold in the palm what otherwise slips through fingers. Michel Foucault might say these artifacts reveal the truth of a society, not through its laws, but through its smallest items. That power whispers in trinkets as loudly as in thrones. Consider one story: a clay tablet describing a ritual where couples buried figurines beneath their homes to secure fertility, believing that the goddess's favor seeped from clay into wombs, and you can't help but imagine the nervous hands of a young bride pressing mud into the earth, whispering hopes into the soil as if the ground itself could carry her prayers upward. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe that crocodile dung, mentioned in Egyptian texts as a contraceptive, may have been shared across Mesopotamian borders, meaning that in the very same world where kings staged sacred marriages to ensure fertility, ordinary women were experimenting with equally earthy methods to prevent it. A contradiction so human, it makes you laugh. Peter Webb in The Erotic Spirit Through History reminds us that symbolism was never neutral. Every amulet, every carved phallus or vulva-shaped pendant carried not only magical hope, but also social instruction, teaching people how to see their own bodies as part of a cosmic cycle. And even the Kama Sutra, written far away in India, mirrors this obsession with symbolic objects, prescribing perfumes, oils, and charms to heighten pleasure, reminding us that across cultures, desire was never just about bodies, it was also about the tools we crafted to guide or guard them. Yet historians still argue whether these Mesopotamian objects truly guided sexual practice, or were simply metaphors rendered in clay. And you realize how hard it is to separate symbol from act, myth from bedroom, when everything is filtered through fragments dug up after thousands of years. You run your fingers across a tablet where a hymn praises Inanna with lines that could double as love poetry, and suddenly the distance collapses. You can hear the hushed voices of scribes, the nervous giggles of apprentices shaping figurines, the serious eyes of priests declaring that this symbol carries power. And you know, in that moment, that objects were not background props, but living pieces of the erotic imagination, each one a doorway into how Mesopotamians understood themselves, their gods, and their desires. You step back, torchlight casting shadows of idols on the wall, and it feels like the room is crowded with silent witnesses, all of them clay, all of them whispering that the truth of sex in Mesopotamia was not only lived, but carried in the palm of your hand. You slip from the storeroom of clay idols into a hall where the air itself seems to vibrate, Not with voices you can see, but with echoes carved into the very bricks. Because here you find songs and hymns that once filled Mesopotamian nights with rhythm. Words that praise lust as if it were light. Poetry that trembles on the edge between. Sacred prayer and intimate confession. And as you listen, you realize the society left behind not just objects but music. Melodies designed to make desire itself unforgettable. Imagine sitting in a courtyard at dusk, torches flickering, as a harpist plucks strings, while a singer intones lines about Inanna's lips like honey and Dumuzi's arms like bronze vines. Verses that would make modern listeners blush, but in that world were offered to gods without a hint of shame. Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings tells us how centuries later troubadours and court poets spun similar songs to glorify affairs, weaving lust into legacy. And here in Mesopotamia, you see the same pattern: kings and priestesses turned into erotic myth through verse, their bodies remembered in rhythm long after their bones were dust. Yet historians still argue whether these hymns describe real acts or symbolic metaphors, whether the passion sung was performed in ritual chambers or simply imagined as part of a cosmic marriage. And you find yourself leaning closer to every wedge-shaped mark on clay, as if you might catch the truth in the spaces between words. Michel Foucault would nod knowingly, pointing out that sexuality here became discourse, spoken and sung, a way to articulate truths that laws and decrees never could. And suddenly you realize that hymns weren't just entertainment, they were tools, shaping how entire communities imagined the relationship between body, God, and king. Then comes the quirky tidbit. One hymn, translated clumsily, compares Inanna's embrace to butter churned fresh from milk, a metaphor both strange and strangely tender, proof that even the most exalted poetry can veer into kitchen imagery when trying to capture the unsayable. You laugh, but it's the kind of laugh that makes you lean in closer, because it reminds you that ancient poets were human too, stretching for words in the same way modern songwriters mix the sublime with the silly. Peter Webb's asterisk, the erotic spirit through history asterisk, emphasizes that erotic songs serve not only to arouse but to teach, embedding cultural values in rhythm. And in Mesopotamia, the lesson was clear. Desire was divine, a force to be celebrated, feared, and sung into memory. Think of one story, drawn from fragments of Inanna's hymn cycle, the goddess herself boasting of her lover Dumuzi, describing his touch, his lips, his seed, with imagery so explicit it makes you blink. Yet these lines were recited as holy scripture, proving again that the boundary between prayer and passion simply didn't exist. And then, as your ears adjust, you notice the other side of this hall, where scribes etch debates into clay, questioning whether such hymns were literal or allegorical, whether kings truly enacted the roles described, or whether the words were meant to inspire fertility in spirit alone. And it hits you that even then scholars were arguing, their disagreements baked into tablets like time capsules of uncertainty. You can almost see two priests in a corner, one insisting that Inanna's song is evidence of ritual sex, the other rolling his eyes, claiming it's only metaphor for rain and crops. And you smile at the thought that academic squabbles are as ancient as the bricks beneath your feet. Yet as the harp strings fade in your imagination, what lingers is the sense of intimacy songs sung by firelight, words carried on warm night air, voices rising together until the city itself hummed with the sound of desire sanctified. You leave the hall dizzy, your mind buzzing with lines that feel both alien and familiar, because you realize that when Mesopotamians lifted their voices to the night, they weren't just praising gods or kings, they were praising the eternal spark of longing that makes humanity itself endure. You step out of the hall of hymns and suddenly the night air feels different, cooler, as if carrying voices not born here. And when you follow the torches down a narrow lane, you find yourself among foreigners, traders from distant lands, emissaries with wide eyes, wanderers scribbling notes that will one day become legends, and every one of them seems caught between fascination and fear at the strange customs of Mesopotamia. Imagine being a Greek merchant who has heard rumors of Babylonian women offering themselves in temples, only to arrive and see processions of priestesses veiled in linen, their steps slow, their faces serene, leaving you unsure whether you've witnessed devotion or desire. Herodotus, centuries later, would write scandalous accounts of every woman required to lie with a stranger in honor of the goddess, a story so lurid it echoed for generations. Yet historians still argue whether this was truth or slander, whether the old traveler exaggerated to shock his audience, or whether fragments of ritual became distorted into myth. You glance at the traders around you and sense how easily stories spread across borders, how one night in a tavern could turn into a legend of orgies by the time it reached Athens. Eleanor Herman in Sex with Kings shows how rulers throughout history feared the gossip of foreigners as much as armies, because rumor corrodes reputation faster than swords. And here in Mesopotamia, that gossip carved entire civilizations into scandalous caricatures. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, you glimpse something real. Mesopotamians did weave sexuality into their myths, telling tales of Inanna descending to the underworld, stripped of her garments one by one until she stood naked before death itself. A story that might have shocked outsiders, but for locals was simply cosmic truth. Michel Foucault would say that the scandal was not in the act, but in the discourse, in the way stories framed sexuality as both dangerous and divine. And as you breathe in the desert air, you realize that foreigners' horror only highlighted how differently Mesopotamians understood the body. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Clay tablets reveal contracts where traveling merchants actually hired women not only for pleasure, but as guides. Their knowledge of the city offered alongside intimacy, which makes you laugh because even in the ancient world, multitasking was profitable. Peter Webb in The Erotic Spirit Through History notes that myths often absorb foreign shock into their fabric, turning travelers' awe into local pride. And so Babylon's reputation as a city of decadence may have been embraced as much as it was denied, a badge of otherness worn like a crown. You picture one story told in caravan camps, a Phoenician sailor claiming he saw women dance naked on temple steps while priests chanted blessings, his eyes wide, his words half fear, half envy. And though no archaeologist has found proof of such spectacles, the power of that tale was enough to shape Babylon's reputation for centuries. Historians still argue whether such myths hide kernels of truth or are nothing more than cultural projections. But as you walk deeper among the foreign voices, you understand that history is as much about perception as fact, and that sometimes the strangest truths are the ones whispered by outsiders. The air thickens with incense, and for a moment you see how cultures mingled here. Egyptian charms traded in markets, Indian tales slipping into local songs, Greek scribes carrying home fragments of ritual they barely understood, and you realize Mesopotamia was not just inventing rituals, but exporting stories, shaping how the world would remember sex, power, and gods, long after the bricks of its ziggurats had crumbled. You pause, heart racing, because you know the final steps of this journey will carry you into ruins where echoes linger. And the question pressing hardest is not what really happened, but why humanity never stopped retelling it. You drift away from the voices of foreigners, and the path grows quieter until even the torches seem reluctant to burn. And suddenly you are walking through ruins, stones cracked and half buried in sand, the ghosts of ziggurats rising only as jagged outlines against a sky where stars blink like watchful eyes. And here you realize you have reached the end of the story, the place where rituals have long since faded, but their shadows cling stubbornly to the world we still live in. The air tastes of dust and something sweeter, like memory itself. And as you run your hand across broken bricks, you feel how fragile every ceremony was, how quickly chants dissolve into silence once mouths close, and yet how stubborn the human need to bind sex to meaning has proven, echoing through time like a drumbeat that never quite stops. Historians still argue whether sacred prostitution ever truly existed, whether the sacred marriage was literal or symbolic. Whether the taverns were extensions of temples or simply rowdy human spaces, but even in their arguments lies proof of the ritual's endurance, because debates that last thousands of years are themselves a kind of afterlife. Eleanor Herman in Sex with Kings points out that power has always used intimacy as spectacle, and you can see that line stretching straight from Mesopotamian courtyards to European palaces, and further still into today's gossip columns where the private lives of leaders are scrutinized with the same breathless hunger. Michel Foucault would remind you that sexuality is discourse, that even when the acts vanish, the way we talk about them reveals our obsessions, and so the absence of certainty in Mesopotamian rituals only sharpens the fascination, making every fragment more alluring. One story lingers, the myth of Inanna and Dumuzi, their love doomed to cycles of loss and return, used for centuries as metaphor for seasons, crops, and mortality. Yet beneath the agricultural symbolism pulses a recognition that desire itself is seasonal, that passion flares and fades but always comes back, like grain from the soil. And then the quirky tidbit that makes you smile: archaeologists uncovered amulets centuries younger than the empires that made them, still shaped like lovers entwined, proving that even as rituals died, their symbols lived on in pockets of daily life, like echoes hiding in jewelry boxes. Peter Webb in The Erotic Spirit Through History insists that erotic customs never truly vanish. They transform, and so the Mesopotamian fusion of lust and liturgy filtered into Greek mystery cults, Roman festivals, medieval fertility charms, and even into modern superstitions whispered at weddings. The Kama Sutra reminds us from afar that every culture struggles to balance pleasure and duty, and Mesopotamia's attempt to sanctify sex rather than suppress it offers a strange mirror to later worlds that chose the opposite. You pause among the ruins, torch guttering, and you feel the weight of thousands of years pressing down, not in silence but in whispers, as if every priestess, king, merchant, and poet left their breath in the stones, and it drifts around you now, carrying both scandal and solace. The truth is that the rituals may never be fully reconstructed, but perhaps that is their greatest gift. They force us to imagine, to question, to confront the uneasy marriage of flesh and faith that defines humanity in every age. You look at the broken stairway of a ziggurat and think of how many feet once climbed it in anticipation, trembling with fear or desire. And though the steps now lead nowhere, your pulse quickens because the memory of their purpose lingers. You inhale, the desert wind brushing your face like the sigh of a forgotten lover, and you realize the journey is ending, though the questions it raised will not leave you soon. And now, as the stars wheel above and the ruins fall silent again, let the pace slow, let the words soften, because you've walked far tonight, deeper than perhaps you expected, and it's time to let the weight of history fade into something gentler. Picture the sand smoothing over broken bricks. Picture torches dimming until only the glow of memory remains. And picture yourself lying back beneath the Mesopotamian sky, the constellations' ancient witnesses that remind you life always goes on. Breathe in slowly, feel your body grow heavier, and let the echoes of drums, laughter, and whispered hymns fade into background hum, no longer urgent, only soothing. Whatever truths those rituals held, whatever mysteries remain unsolved, you can leave them here tonight, resting where they belong. Close your eyes, release the questions, and let the soft wind carry you into sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.